Thank you all so much for joining us. And I just want to welcome you to our virtual Craft Chat series. Our Craft Chat series is a place where we talk with writers maybe a little less about what they wrote and a little bit more about how they wrote it. I am Zach Powers. I'm the Director of Communications at the Writers Center. I'm also a novelist and a fiction writer. So that's why I'm the one talking to Iman today. So it's my real pleasure to introduce our guest, our special, wonderful guest, a DC area novelist with a debut novel out, Iman Quota. Welcome to the Writers Center. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here because the Writers Center has meant a lot to me in my time as a writer. When I first moved to DC, I remember asking somebody, where should I go to take classes? And they told me to go to the Writers Center. And I took classes from Richard Peabody, Liz Reese, Leslie Petrick, Aga Shahid Ali, really amazing writers, some of whom I'm still in touch with. Leslie is an amazing promoter of other people's work. Richard, everybody knows. And in fact, a very, very early version of my book, which ended up on the cutting room floor, was workshopped in his class. He probably doesn't remember that. And now he told me recently that he was gonna advertise my book in Gargoyle. So just everything comes full circle, and I'm really excited to be here.
Well, thank you so much. Do you have your book handy?
I do.
Could you just read a few paragraph excerpt, just something so people who haven't had a chance to look at the book yet get a taste of your writing and have an idea of what we're going to be chatting about in terms of craft here going forward?
Sure. So this is a scene early in the book. Two of the main characters are Munir and Saida. They're newlyweds from Saudi Arabia. They've come to Cleveland in the early 1970s to study, as some Saudis did at that time and still do. And this is about their early married life. Neither of them knew how to cook, so they'd spent a month's rent on phone calls to their mothers. To measure the rice, they'd need a jam jar, his mother had said. He and Saida hadn't hesitated, emptying a whole jar of raspberry jam into the garbage disposal. Saida bent her ear to the phone, pulling the cord across the living room so she could relay their mother's recipes to Munir in their kitchen, which was not much bigger than a bathroom. The Bukhari rice came out too moist, stewed with cinnamon sticks and cardamom pods that lay bloated and spent alongside the chunks of lamb. Later, they tried chicken and rice poached in milk. Salig was meant to be soggy, Munir joked, so of course, they mastered it easily.
Thank you so much. So my first question, and this is the first question we like to ask all our guests, and it's had some fun answers, so hopefully it was an interesting question to you too. What's one thing about your writing or about something you did in this book in particular that nobody has seemed to notice or comment on?
Yeah, so when I first read this question, when you sent it to me, Zach, I was a little bit stumped. And then I thought of it and I was so proud of myself. My humor, I don't think anybody has said this is a funny book, but I think that people have said, it's a fractured family saga. It's very dramatic. But I think there is a lot of humor kind of hidden in the book. I think there's a little in that section that I read, and I think in later, there's a scene where one of the characters is wearing an abaya, which is a black robe that is typically worn in Saudi Arabia. And I find those as funny as high heels, just in the way that they kind of mess you up. I think some of the dialogue is funny. So yeah, I hope that people will kind of look for the little bits of humor in there, even though it's in some ways kind of a tragic book. Tragedy and comedy, we know, are sort of flip sides of the same coin.
No, it is, there is actual absolutely humor throughout. So I'm glad you pointed that out. Yeah, I was like, and I'm like, oh yeah.
There's a little.
I mean, it's interesting too, because I feel like sometimes one of the biggest issues is the marketing. They push the marketing for one thing and it almost, we're all susceptible to that push.
I mean, it's not a comic book by, any stretch of the imagination. It's not humor writing, but I think that, I always try to see kind of the humorous side of things, even things that are hard and sad. And so I think that there is that sprinkled in the book.
Absolutely. So the first topic broadly I wanted to cover is detail. And I want to do that because I think that's the part of your writing that jumped out immediately for me, was scenic detail in particular. The novel is immersive, and a large portion of the text is given over to details of place and character. I mean, a lot of the word count real estate goes to that, and
Yeah.
and it works. And I think that's also a challenge to do, because we could go to the old Russian novelists, describing every button on a jacket, and that's not what you do. But you have this really great knack for interesting details. So that's where I wanted to start. So what do you look for in details? What catches your eye?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it has to like put you into the scene. Um, Sometimes details help to tell you something about the characters. Just to talk about that paragraph I read, somebody said to me that they thought there was a lot in the book that seemed like it was pulled from real life, and they use that scene as an example. And I have never heard of anyone throwing out an entire raz jam jar in order to cook. Like, I've never heard of that. I made that up. But the thing that's true, the detail, that the one truth is that when I was growing up in Saudi, a lot of times they use the jam, and then they use the jam jar to measure things, and they didn't have like measuring cups. They had jam jars. Also, there was this kind of cheese, white cheese called puck cheese, and people would turn those glass jars into teacups. So that's a true detail. And then I took it and like put it into the hands of the characters, and what would these two like super young, not really compatible people in this very foreign to them country do? And that led me to them sort of throwing out the jam, and kind of failing at learning to cook these traditional foods that were supposed to give them comfort. I think another thing about the details in this book is that the book is about sort of a really overwhelming experience. It's about parental abduction. It's about someone who's yanked away from her life and her culture. It's about a parent who has lost his child. It's about a parent who's on the run. These are really overwhelming circumstances. And I think that I wasn't thinking, oh, I need to have a lot of details because everybody's overwhelmed. But I think that maybe instinctually, kind of having so much detail really puts you almost, the reader is like, oh, so in retrospect, I'd like to think that maybe that the detail is serving that purpose of creating that atmosphere of the book.
Is there anything else that you try to have details accomplish? Because that's a really interesting way to do it. Is there anything beyond that? And I think too, because you've hit a really key point, I think, in especially what we call literary fiction, is the idea that everything you do ends up like serving at least a couple functions.
Right.
And so I think details literally show you things in the scene, but you're also saying here how they've served in another way. Are there any other ways that you use details to serve the storytelling?
Yeah, I mean, I think they put you in certain places. They also put you in certain times, so that that talking on the phone and how much it cost, and like that's not a detail from today, right? We were on WhatsApp groups and texting. My family and I are Zooming or video chatting every weekend. Like, so the details of how people had to like stay in touch with each other, and many other details are kind of to put you in that time and place. I think that it's also like the more details you put, the more you can be wrong, right? Like, so it's like, the more you can be like, even things that you like really know, like I find that you can accidentally write them wrong. You know, there is a street in Shaker Heights, Ohio that I nearly called an avenue instead of a boulevard. And I was like, how could I not have known that? I grew up driving up and down that street. But so the more you have details as a writer, the more you need to like double check, make sure you got everything right. And if you have a lot of details in a book, that can get you in trouble. So I think it's like, I'm not really answering your question, but I think I'm talking about the experience of doing it, is that, you know, it's something that you have to be really careful with, I think. But I love them. Like in reading other people's work, I think sometimes just one well-placed detail is enough to make a scene come to life, right? You don't need a lot of details. And one true thing, I think, like the jam jar, can make people feel like the whole thing is real, even if you've made like 90% of it up.
No, I love that. And I don't think detail is one of those things that's always heralded. And I don't think we often caution enough about the fact that there are ways to go wrong with, even not like egregiously wrong. There's little small ways to go wrong with detail.
But not all readers like it. You know, they'll be like, there's too many details. It slowed things down. I didn't need all that detail. Like some people love it. You know, some people are like, it was so immersive and I really enjoyed all the carefully chosen details. And other readers are like, just give me the plot, give me a little character. Like that's all I need. And I read a lot of books like recently where I feel like the place details are very spare. In fact, I think that is almost like kind of where we're going with a lot of stuff. And sometimes that's good. And sometimes I feel like, well, I feel like I'm in a Starbucks. Like, is this really Cleveland, Ohio? Like, so yeah, I think you can go wrong in either direction. And it's also like a certain kind of book. A detail heavy book is a certain kind of book for a certain kind of reader.
Mm-hmm. But I also want to just, for people that I don't think you have I wouldn't call your book detail heavy.
No.
I think it's just really that there's a lot of good detail, and that's one of the strengths of the book, that these details flow naturally. But I also think details are like part of the contract with the reader, between the writer and the reader.
Yeah.
As a writer, I give the reader what they need to be oriented. And maybe that's what you're talking about too. You don't want to give too many details beyond what they really need.
Right.
And to experience my scenes, but I don't want to overburden them with things they might be familiar with. I'm not Proust. I'm not an old Russian novelist, so I don't want to go in that direction either. Is there a difference then between how you approach scenes in a setting in which you can expect the reader to be more familiar with the setting? I'm thinking of W's house with its wonderful, the window of plants. Like I didn't need that. That was a wonderful scene for me. Just like I was there immediately as soon as that like window and plants, and I didn't need to get into the super details. I know what a window in this kind of town looks like. I know a person who likes a lot of plants would make that look like. And
that post-war house with the window in the front. Yeah.
Yep. As opposed to how do you use details in a place where you wouldn't expect your reader to be familiar with some of the basic elements? Is that something you consider as you write?
I mean, so to me, I feel like some readers are going to be familiar with some things and other readers are going to be familiar with other things. And I can't assume that the reader will know or not know, right? Mm-hmm. So there are some people who have read my book who may have grown up in Saudi Arabia like I did, or who may have grown up in the Midwest like I did, and some people who didn't. So I don't think I do differentiate. I think that in any case, you want to have details that are easy to grasp, you know, and sometimes even I feel like it doesn't matter if people don't know all of the background to a detail. So the scene that I read you guys about the jam jars, like you didn't know, I mean, the mom says you need a jam jar, but you didn't know that that's super common, you know? Does that matter? But for someone who does know, it'll be like, oh yeah, you know? And I was thinking, cause I was thinking about the jam jar scene, I was thinking about Kamala Harris and Mindy Kaling did a video last year during the election, and they were cooking together, and Kamala comes into Mindy Kaling's house and she has all of these jars filled with spices. And it was like, oh, your family did that too. And for me, it was like, oh, that's a really cool detail about, the kind of family that they grew up in. I didn't know that. So there's different kinds of responses to details, and that's okay. I'm fine with that.
So there's a question from the chat I want to go to,
Sure.
just because it's on this topic, and it's maybe a better question than my next one was, which is related. So I'm going to go there. In fiction, how much does detail have to correspond to real life, and what we were talking about a bit earlier?
Yeah.
Example, a school name from childhood, does it have to be the same name?
Yeah, I think that is sort of can be up to the writer. I think so. Particularly, I guess I'm going to move a little bit into place, but place and detail are really like connected for me. Like, hang on, I've got a couple of different examples. So one is like the places in the book. Most of the places in the book are real. Like the particular houses, no, but the places that people go are real. There's one place in the book that I totally made up. I decided to make up the California town. I'm not 100% sure why I decided that particular place. It might have been because I was less familiar with California places than I was with Cleveland, Ohio, and Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. So I felt like I didn't want to get it wrong, so I made it up. So aspiration is a little bit like some parts of California I grew up visiting because my mom is from California. And Paradise is a place that I went a lot. And Paradise, actually, while the book was getting finished, Paradise basically burned down. And so, there were a lot of reasons to fictionalize it. So I did. And so it was fun to just make up details of the town. How many stores are in this town? There's a nursery, plant store, where one of the characters works. There's a phone booth on the corner. Like I made all of that up, like completely. When I was working with Cleveland or with Jeddah, I had to be more true to life. So I probably made up a few things, but I didn't want to, you can't make up a coastline where there's no coastline, the beach, the particular beach in the Cleveland area where they go is real. So I think there are choices that authors make about whether to make those things completely true to life or to make them up. And what was the other example I was going to give? Shoot. It was, okay. So this was sort of like a historical event. So most of the historical events that are referenced in the book are things that really happened. But there's a part of the book in the late 80s where the characters are in Ohio, and when they're at home in the house, there's a hijacking going on that's on TV. And I remember growing up, like watching this stuff on the news, and in my mind there was one that went on for days, and all you saw was the airplane on the tarmac. And so I wrote that in. I didn't double check what hijacking it was or when it happened. I just wrote it in. And during the fact checking, they were like, the copy editor was like, everything else that happened is really true, but this one thing, I cannot find a hijacking like this that happened in this year. And I was like, oh, well, we're just going to make it up. We're just going to, because there were things like this happening during that time, I felt okay with it. I wasn't making up a type of event that never happened. I was hijackings really were a problem in the 80s. Like, I mean, there probably weren't as many of them as I think they were in my mind, but they were. And they were, because a lot of them were committed by people from the Arab world. and my family always had the news on. Like, it's something that I remember, and it's part of my experience as an Arab American. So I felt like it was true enough to leave it in. But everything else was pretty carefully researched to make sure it was right.
Yeah, there were a lot of them, because I went to I went to a book talk about a guy who wrote a book on the history of hijacking, and how the reason it was before modern security measures are put, not even modern, like pre 9/11 security measures, just like normal airport security. It was cheaper to let people hijack planes than it was to install security at airports and install security protocols. So they didn't.
Right.
And allowed planes to get hijacked until a plane was crashed or there was death involved, and it was no longer cheaper to do it. So it was a really fascinating book. So yes, your memory is correct on that part, at least.
And it was seen as like a political tool by certain people, like, and it's just not anymore. So.
And just on that too, I mean, as a fiction writer, I have absolutely no hesitation diving into and out of a real thing.
Yeah.
Like, personally, like, oh, here's a real bar. Oh, here's a real coffee shop. This is not the counter in that coffee shop. Is that counter seats 2? I need this counter to seat 6.
Yeah, yeah.
So I've suddenly made this counter, which is a real counter, 3 times as big as it was in reality. And like, I don't care. I'm like, that's why it says novel and not memoir or something else.
Exactly. And it's fun, right? It's fun to it's both fun to take real details that and it's also fun to make things up or to change them. It's just super fun.
So for any writers maybe struggling to create good details, do you have any advice, or maybe a concrete tip or two, something that you turn to when you're feeling stuck in a scene feels unrealized or flat? Or
that's a good question. I think when you're writing drafts, it's okay to have too much or not enough detail. Like, if it's easier for you to just like write it, you just write the scene and not worry about the details, and then kind of add them back in. But also, if you're just like, oh, I want to put all this stuff in, and then you like take it back out, I think either way is okay. I think you want to think about details you don't just want details to be like quirky for quirk's sake, or but like, here's a detail that I've been thinking about. There's a scene where they're on the beach, and it's a pretty dramatic scene. And there's a guy walking around and it's winter and it's cold, and there's a guy walking around with a metal detector. And I think that I first of all, I put that guy there because I remember being on the beach at Menor Headlands in Ohio, and there always seemed to be someone with a metal detector, probably not in the middle of winter, but whatever. But then, it's like this really tense scene. And again, getting back to the humor, I felt like I needed something. I don't know. I think I just put it in, but eventually for me anyways, it might not make sense to someone else reading it, be like, what's that guy doing there? But it felt like it ups the absurdity. It brings in this kind of, not levity, but something that is not them. That is not the two people who are, basically Munir has to save Saida from the water. And it sort of, I felt like it kind of makes you kind of go like this in the scene. So think about what details are doing in the scene to the reader and to you as the writer. Are they like, if they're taking people away from the main action, is that good? Is that what you want? Like, if they're helping people, are they helping people to understand a character? Are you putting something there that's going to show up later? It's that smoking gun or whatever. Like, think about the details. But I would say you don't have to do it in the first draft, because I think getting too bogged down in that could keep you from writing forward. And also, I think that sometimes we don't really know what details make the most sense until later.
Instead of Chekhov's gun from now on, I'm going to talk about Quota's metal detector.
Yeah, that's right. It has no real purpose.
But I think that's really interesting too, that another maybe thing, like I was getting a lesson from that too, which is details don't have to be absolutely integral to the character or the action. That's one of the, sometimes that little absurd moment is really powerful in creating a distance, or I mean, sometimes you want to create distance. Sometimes you want to do, yeah,
Yeah,
effect is really, it's really fascinating the way you thought about that.
maybe. Yeah. I think that's right. I think that, I mean, you don't want a detail to be there that has no purpose, or it just like you just want it to be there for prettiness. Although maybe, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can use details, just like you use other tools of the craft.
Mm. Oh, so I have another couple questions from the chat I wanted to go to from earlier, and they were about humor. So they were after we were talking about humor at the beginning. And the first part of the question was, is the humor in your book ironic humor? And then in general, what is your opinion about irony in modern literature?
Oh, I don't know. I always have trouble kind of recognizing exactly what irony is, but I don't know if my humor is ironic. I think it's probably, it might be sarcastic, dark, a little bit dark. Irony, I mean, there probably is irony in this book. I mean, there's a lot of places where there are bigger things happening than the characters realize. And um, my opinion of irony in modern literature. Sure, I'm for it. That's good.
I mean, I think sometimes too, and I've just read something on this, and I'm going to fail as an advocate for literature by not remembering where I read it, but
That's okay.
it was just talking about the fact that theme is in a way inherently ironic because
Okay.
it's always authorial intent played against character action. So it's
Mhm.
always, so theme is a sort of dramatic irony in that it's putting something on top, something that the characters don't know on top of it that the reader is going to understand. So
Right.
that irony is perhaps in some pure distilled form uh inherent, that if you have a theme in your book, it's something that the reader knows that the characters don't usually.
Yeah, I mean, I think a central irony in this book is that, I mean, I don't want to say what it is because it's a spoiler. So you have to read the book. But I think there is a central irony in the book that has to do with motherhood, parenthood, and family. And if I think about recent books that I've read and whether they use irony, I'd have to think about that. Because I don't know that it's something that if I'm not in a literature class, I'm not thinking about that as a reader all the time.
Yeah. So we have a couple more detail questions. So we're sticking with detail. This is
All
the
right.
all detail version of a virtual craft chat.
Let's craft chat.
So this one goes to setting a little bit though too. So you talk about using details to create a sense of place. What is your process like when you want to write about setting? How do you enter the place in your mind? Are there any specific things that you do?
Yeah, I know, Zach, you commented that there are a lot of places in the book that are also in my biography. So I'm going to weave that into this a little bit too. I think that um, I think place and setting, part of it does have to do with details, some description, but I think that a lot of writers these days don't do a lot of place description. The place is about, like how the characters act and can be part of place. I think um, I'm trying to think of specific parts of the book and how I went about writing about the places. I think I did use places I knew. And part of that was because, so that's easy in some ways, but hard in others because you know so much about a place. Like, what do you pull out? What kinds of behaviors do people have that are different in that place than other places? Like, it's sometimes hard to choose, but there's a lot to choose from. When you're making up a place, like making up the California town, it was like, well, I'm really into houses. Like, where did they live? They like live one place and then they move another. Where did they work? what, how big is this place? What's the weather like? How do you get from place to place here? And I also think that I set a lot of the book in places that I have been because um, the books, the plot, the main events of the novel are things that I have not experienced. So, parental abduction is not something I've experienced in any side of it. It's something that happened to a family friend, so I'm quite removed. I'm removed from it. And so I think having places that I knew made it easier to write parts of it. It grounded me, and I think it will ground the reader in things that I know. So it's kind of a combination of writing what I knew and what I didn't know. And I think one of the reasons that place and setting are so important in this book is because it's about identity that's linked to place. It's about leaving places and going to places. So that was really important. More about how you create setting. I think always thinking about when the characters are moving around, like it's kind of like, where are they? And you don't have to describe every chair they're sitting in, but for you to know kind of like where they are. And again, like, what's the weather today? And what does this place smell like? And what's the light like today? And those are also, again, I think, sometimes a scene definitely has to take place in a particular location or setting, and sometimes it doesn't, and you might bring in the setting later. But I feel like it's sort of like, oh, I know what I wanted to say is that so in this book I write a lot about places that I know, but I have a manuscript that is set in 13th century Baghdad, and I've written a story that was set in 20th century Baghdad, and like I've never been to Baghdad either in the 20th or 13th century. So that was fun because I had to do research about place, research about the setting, and so you don't have to know the places, to be able to describe them. I think it helps to have been somewhere or been somewhere like it. But no one's been to 13th century Baghdad, right? And so, and if you're writing like sci-fi, no one's lived in space. So you can, do certain kinds of research and reconnaissance that gets you a sense of what it would be like, and then you just make up the rest, right?
Yeah, that's great. So I do want to flip now to another topic. I'm not bored with detail, but I want something else, and I have some
let's go for it.
Character development as well. So character development is topic number 2. So your 3 main characters. I mean, there are several other characters too, but I feel like there are the 3 main ones. And and for me, you expertly moved each of them up and down the spectrum of relatability and sympathy. There's times where I related to all of them. There's times where like, I'm not quite on your side right now.
I love that you said that. That's so cool.
So that's just have characters who have that's difficult to do. I mean, that's difficult to have characters that hit you in different ways and still feel like the same person when you're reading them. So kudos to that. But how do you approach character development just broadly?
I'm not really sure. Like, I think a lot of times they kind of live in my head. And I think part of what happens is like you put them in scenes and like kind of see what happens, how you want them to react in that scene, and kind of like sometimes too like contrasting characters with each other. So like Munir and his best friend, like I felt like putting them in scenes together helped me see each of them. Like putting Hanadi in scenes with her father, in scenes with her grandfather and her aunt, like sort of helps me to see each of the characters by contrasting them against each other. And then just kind of, you know, um, yeah, kind of seeing what they do. The more you write, the more you get to know them. And I did some switching like towards the end where some things that had happened to one character ends up happening to another character. And then that sort of changes that character for you, right? The character who is now doing the thing that you thought another character was going to do. It's like, oh, okay, now this is going to change this character as this experience happens to them. So I think it's really, for me, it's really organic. Like I do think I had a certain vision of, especially the main characters starting out, but I don't think I knew them completely until I finished the book.
That's great. Just a quick midpoint reminder to do buy a copy of the book. We're a little past the midpoint, but please go to the link that Amy shall provide again at some point here in the near future and buy a copy of the book. You'll be wonderfully rewarded for your effort and time reading it. So keeping with character for a second, are there any steps you make sure that your characters stay true to themselves? Because they do go up and down this slide. Like, and I guess maybe this question is also a revision question, because how do characters happen, say, in draft 1 versus how do the characters change as you're going through and building the novel? How much character happens right away? How much is the tough work of going back and going back and going back through?
Yeah. There's an example of like, one of the daughter, Hanadi, she's the one who's kidnapped by her mom, and then she's reunited with her dad. And she's like in college. She goes to Saudi Arabia for the first time since she was very young. She doesn't really remember it. And while she's there, she shoplifts. And a couple of people who read the book, before publication were like, this seems out of character for her. And I was like, no, I don't think it is. And, maybe there was like a little more explaining you had to do about, why, or the situation that would make her do it, but I felt like, I think people do things that are out of character all the time. Like, out of character. Like I've done stupid things that people are that I'm sure if I told someone, they'd be like, I can't believe you did that. You're so responsible or whatever. But people need to believe it. Right. And so I do think that a lot of times we're like, that character would never do that. Well, they just did. So
I'm going to say though, that like, that was so believable to me.
Yeah.
This is a character who has dropped out of college in the middle of a semester, traveled across the world. Like, headspace not perfect at this point.
Yeah, right. Exactly. She's doing dumb things.
She's gonna grab a cassette tape.
Yeah, sure. Why not?
Yeah.
But I think also, like, again, not every, like, I think I can convince some readers. I may not convince every reader. And I think that happens in real life. When we were talking about, my colleagues at work and I were talking about, that woman who, like, sorry, it was that, what's that guy's name, where she dated the guy who was in prison? Do you know what I'm talking about? Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Anyways, we were talking about this journalist who dates
Oh yeah. Okay, I can't remember
what I'm talking about. And my friends at work were like, why would she do that? I'm like, who knows why she would do that? Like, who knows? People do dumb things. So I'm a big believer in people doing dumb things. So I think I will oftentimes believe these crazy things that characters do, but not everybody does. So you do have to kind of like make sure that it's not just true to the character. It's like, makes sense to the reader. Did they understand sort of why you as a writer are making this happen? I guess even because you're making this character do things, right? But I think especially like, you do want the characters to feel like real people, right? And so you do want them to have qualities that people can recognize from the beginning of the book to the end. And then if they veer from those qualities, then that tells you something about what is happening to them or what happened to them. So a character who is very honorable or loyal or honest, and then they do something that's not that, then, well, what happened to make that happen? Not necessarily like a psychological explanation, but like, you know, there needs to be some sort of, it needs to tell you something. I don't know if reason is the right word, but it needs to tell you something about the character and their journey.
I think you're probably also being punched a little bit, because the shoplifting character is also very, I'm sure, very much liked by the time you get to, I mean, like, just because it's a good character, also it's a character that sort of is the one who's been a victim, maybe
Right.
more than anyone else in the story. So you have people rooting for her, and so when this moment happens, I feel like they're wrong. I'm just saying that whoever said that was wrong. But anyway,
That was my agent.
I'll give her a call. Back up a little. Oh, it was someone commenting in the report. It was the Bloomberg reporter who dated, Martin Schreckle.
Schreckle, thank you.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah,
I'm terrible with details. Yeah.
So at what point in the revision process, or did you in the revision process start to decide to make characters, to start acting out of character? Is that a decision-making process, or gut feeling, or?
I think, I mean, I think, like I said, when characters act out of character, there's like some sort of impetus in the plot or in their experiences.
And I guess my question was, do characters surprise you? And I feel like this might be the moment. Like, is there a moment where you're writing and the character is doing something that is?
I didn't know they were going to do that. You know, I don't think I really experienced that too much, because I do feel like I'm manipulating them and I get to decide what they do. But you know, something that surprised me, and then maybe led to a surprise about the characters. It's more, okay, so here's what happened. So the book sort of ended after it ends now, and my editor was like, I think maybe it ends here. What do you think about ending it here, where it currently ends? And then I had to do some editing to kind of get us there. But that changed the feeling of the book at the end. It changed how you feel about the characters. And that surprised me. It surprised me that such an easy change, which is like, get rid of those 20 pages, would add so much, like add so many layers and richness to the end of the book. And I think a lot of people have commented that you kind of, I think you commented too, that you kind of change your allegiance to the characters a little at different times. And I think that the ending now kind of does that a little bit, and leaves you in a different place than you might have been left if it had ended the way that I originally had it. So that surprised me a lot. Not that I wasn't surprised that cutting could be a good decision. I was more surprised at how much it improved the book. You know, it wasn't just, no, let's just end here. That's good. It was like, oh, wow, so many possibilities of meaning have been opened up by just stopping where we're stopping now. And I think that led not the characters to surprise me, because I think that sort of this final choice that happens at the end is one that I totally think the character would make, but more surprised me sort of how that choice impacted the character, you know, or how I imagine it beyond the book impacting the character.
So we have a writing process question. So I want to do that from the chat for a second. How
Sure.
long did it take you to write the first draft? And how did having a day job and or family help or hinder the process?
um, so the first, I don't really write first drafts. I kind of like write and write and write and write and write and go back and edit. Right. But the book was done for the first time. It took 5 years. Um, and then through the like submission process, it had to be edited a couple more times.
Mhm. So just as your journey as a writer, when did you start writing? I mean, was this something you've done and then I don't know, what was your journey as a writer? I won't go more than that.
Yeah, I mean, I've always wanted to be a writer since like first grade. And my first, I didn't really answer the question about family, but I can do that as I answer this question. Um, yeah, my first publication was I wrote a story for Girl Scouts for a badge, and it got published. It was called The Life of a Raindrop. And then, I've written, since then, since I was a teenager, since college. Um, you know, I started I mentioned that I had, um, left some stuff on the cutting room floor. So I like started the first version of this book, and then it just wasn't working, and I wrote another manuscript. I mean, I think a lot of people will probably recognize this process. And then I started again, and that was sort of the 5-year period. And during that time, it was like, yeah, a job gets in the way, but I've had really supportive family and friends, and coworkers. So I have gone through all sorts of different arrangements to get more time to write. And I am hoping that the next manuscript I write can be a more efficient process from all the things I've learned from that. But I kind of feel like taking that long to write a book sometimes, I think I wouldn't have written this same book if I had written it in the beginning. And I think that the time that it took, the world changed, I changed, my family changed. When I first started thinking about this book, I wasn't married, I didn't have kids. And I think that having that perspective it changed what the book looked like in the end. So.
From the chat again, what kept you writing your book for 5 years? Did you ever doubt your idea or get burnt out? How do you keep going as a writer through the long haul of writing a novel?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm never gonna finish this. And then my husband would be like, yes, you are. No one's ever gonna publish it. Yeah. Happened all the time. I think for burnout, I think that, you have to let yourself take breaks and be like, I'm not working on this right now. I mean, there were times during that period when I was working on something else instead. So it wasn't like I was working on it every day for 5 years. And I think that you have to like realize that it's a long haul. I mean, some people write a book in a much shorter period of time. That's cool. Everybody's different. It can be hard though. I mean, there were times when I was like, if I didn't do this, I could have other hobbies, So, but like, maybe I don't want other hobbies. I don't know.
That's great. So I think that was the last of the questions I had in the chat. So I'm gonna go back to just real quick. We have a few minutes left, and I would like to bring up plot because I think you have an interesting
Yeah.
this novel. So it's driven by a decades-long tension of these three primary characters I mentioned before. It's a family that forms, splinters, reforms, and splinters, and that's a very overly simple explanation of what's going on here. But there's forming and splintering of the family, not always all together. So this is obviously a plot, but I also think of the novel more in terms of just forward motion. I mean, it's not, there isn't, it covers decades, so there's not a single thing you're sort of following in that classic story arc
Right.
of one character. The hero's journey does not occur here in the sense of the hero's journey.
Yeah.
So how do you think about plot or forward motion? Is there any difference in terms of plot versus forward motion? I mean, maybe that's the essential question.
Yeah. Well, this is my funny answer. You can create forward motion by making your chapters shorter. All my chapters were really long, and then I like noticed that some books have these like short chapters. I think All the Light We Cannot See is one of them. Like, and you want to turn the page, right? So I mean, it won't help a book that has no forward momentum of its own, but I think that like shortening the chapters actually does help, and it helps you to think about where are you ending things and where are you starting things, you know, instead of just long stuff. But to be more serious, I think that so this plot is about there's an abduction that happens, and then the family's reunited. So I always knew that those two things were going to happen. There are different, there's this long line of that plot, and you could start the story at different places. And when I first started writing the book, the place where I was starting was the reunion, right? And then what happens after, maybe for a couple of years, that's what I was focused on. I rolled it back and I started with the beginning of the marriage. And when I did that, it was too like, oh, people thought they were so cute. And I'm like, no, this is going to fall apart. You can't think that. So I moved it forward a little bit to when the marriage is starting to dissolve. And there are flashbacks to the beginning of the marriage when things were better, where we start. And then we go to the reunion. And then, you know, you could stop there. In fact, there's a great book that came out last year called Tea by the Sea by Donna Hemmons, which is about a very similar situation. And she starts and ends in different places. She starts with the father leaving the hospital with the baby, and she ends with the reunion. And it's actually a really like explosive reunion, and that's where you end, you know. It's a great book. Everybody should read that book and buy that book. But my book goes beyond the reunion. So I decided, you know what happens? Like, people live, like you reunite, and then what happens? Our lives are long. And so I wanted to take it further. And like I said, I ended it in the wrong place at first. But so that's, you know, I wasn't thinking it that way while I was writing. I mean, I was thinking like, where do I start? Where do I end? Where do I go? But I think now being able to look back and be like, okay, there were all these choices that I could have made, and these were the ones that I made. And hopefully this will help me with my next project to really think about it in that way. You know, why am I starting here? Why am I ending here? How are we going to get there? And it's kind of like an arc, but not exactly. And I feel that, you know, originally I wanted to tell the story in like 7 or 8 points of view, and it kind of moved chronologically, but we went from person to person to person. Eventually I pared it down to those 3, but the other characters their stories are kind of embedded inside the points of view. And it's almost like, you know, maybe a more Middle Eastern story structure. Maybe it's a more like nesting doll story structure. Not exactly, because it's different nesting dolls. But I think that perspective is part of the plotting of this book. Who's telling the story when? And what do we learn at which points in time? And I've been really pleased that people think the book has a plot, because I don't really think of, like, I didn't start with the plot. I mean, I started with those events, obviously, but it's really cool that it ended up that way.
That's great. Well, we're here right about at the end of the event, but I did want to ask one final request, more than a question.
Sure.
Can you share one final piece of writing advice for the writers out there listening to us and watching this video in the future?
Yeah, first I want to thank everybody for coming on a Friday night and letting me talk about craft. Zach, I've really enjoyed talking about that aspect of the book and not just what happens in the book. It's been really fun. My advice is write what only you can write. That's it.
That's great. Thank you so much for joining us, Iman. It's
Sure,
been
thank you.
fantastic. Please, everyone buy a copy of the book. It's a great book. It's
Yeah,
well
thank you.
your time and your financial contribution to the writer and the publisher and the literary world. So please buy a copy, and everyone have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.